All right, we live. Bear with us. Having a little technical difficulty. Brother Yuan should be with us here shortly. We live, bro.
Khan, shalom. You already went to the intro?
Live.
Khan, shalom.
Shalom.
Shalom lakam, which is peace unto you all. Anachanawaha Aibar Shalay with the Hebrew Israelites coming to you week in and week out through the spirit and power of Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, to preach to you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, West Indians, Haitians, and Israelite foreigners. Nachamatam, Kaya, Hamalaka Tashamayim, Kwara, repent ye for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Before we start, we're going to give our praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Rachak, Kodash, by double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone that taught us his truth and rule well. And much respect to you, bros, out there pushing his truth with our righteousness and sincerity. Shalom.
Shalom.
All right, so we got the lesson entitled as Home Improvement. All right, in episode number 1. All right, and ultimately, as with the physical example, with home improvement, you'll start with different rooms. All right, you'll have a fence, or you'll have different things that are pretty much make the home's value to appreciate over time. So essentially, in this truth, we have to deal with home improvement, to improve our houses. All right, in the Lord Yahweh Shai. So I want to get this first, and then we'll get Psalms chapter 119 and verse 9. All right. So it says, home improvement is crucial for property appreciation because it transforms a home from a depreciating asset subject to natural wear and tear into modernized, high demand, and efficient asset that directly increases its market value. All right, so we have to increase our market value. All right, notice how it says it transforms a home from a depreciating asset subject to natural wear and tear into a modernized, high demand, and efficient asset that directly increases its market value. Because that old man ultimately has to be turned into a new creature in the Lord Yahweh Shai. So it says, while market trends can lift a home's value, strategic renovations allow homeowners to directly command higher prices by addressing buyer preferences, enhancing curb appeal, increasing functional square footage, and improving structural longevity. So even in like construction, they got different things like called like structural loads are different factors that will ultimately affect the home and make it depreciate over time. All right, so same thing with the wisdom, because ultimately we have to make our homes appreciate over time. That's what our scriptures say, to put off the weak nature. So could we start with that? Second Esdras chapter 14 and verse 13.
So, Khan. Second Ezra's 14 and 13.
Mm-hmm.
This is Second Ezra chapter 14 and verse 13. And it reads, Now therefore set thine house in order, and reprove thy people, comfort such of them as be in trouble, and now renounce corruption.
Mm-hmm. So it says, now therefore set thine house in order and reprove thy people, and it says it in order, because the Lord said, let all things be done decently and in order. So it says, now therefore set thine house in order. Scriptures tell us, Isaiah 58:1, cry aloud, spare not, lift up thy voice like a trumpet, because the Lord is ultimately filling up those breaches. All right. And in that process, all right, the prophets have to bring out the word, all right, to the rest of the nation, of Yasher Allah. All right, but before that process, we have to look at ourselves inwardly. All right. So it says, now therefore set thine house in order. And how we do that ultimately is by making our houses appreciate, cleansing our spirit, through the spirit. We have to look at the things we have to work on before, we ultimately can bring them out to Jake. All right. So it says, now therefore set thine house in order and reprove thy people. All right, we ultimately reprove ourselves and we reprove our people by bringing out these scriptures. It says, comfort such of them as be in trouble. Let me get a quick precept. This is Isaiah This is Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 1. It says, comfort ye, my people, saith the Lord. Excuse me, saith your power. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned, for she hath received of the Lord's hand double for all her sins. So ultimately we have put ourselves into this predicament because we sinned against our power. All right. And it says, reading in the back, in the middle, it says, cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished. So being that we sin, all right, our houses are ultimately in a very low state. It's low vibrational. All right, so before coming into this truth, all right, so
Mm-hmm.
ultimately subscribing to the Lord Yahweh Shai Hamashayach, subscribing to the comfort, subscribing to that speech, or that comfortable speech, or going into the scriptures. That's ultimately what makes our houses appreciate over time, because when we're going to ultimately what it is that is going to be comprised in that house is going to be those different chambers. I'm gonna get this precept real fast, and then I'm gonna go back to Second Esdras. This is Proverbs chapter 24, and we'll get verse 3. Excuse me, Proverbs 24 and verse 3. And it says, through wisdom is an house builded, and by understanding it is established. So our house can be likened unto our spirit. So it says, through wisdom is an house builded, and by understanding it is established. So understanding ultimately allows for us to be rooted, all right, to be rooted in the Lord Yahweh Shai. And that word for understanding goes into the ability to discern, all right, using the wisdom to be able to discern, between what's good and what's not, because that goes into the fear of the Lord. That's one of those rooms that's inside that house. All right. So it says, verse 4, and by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. It says, a wise man is strong, yea, a man of knowledge increaseth strength. All right. So bring back to verse 4, it says, and by knowledge shall all the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. So the rooms, the chambers, because that word for chambers goes into the room. All right. This word for chambers in Hebrew will be chadar yam, and it says chamber, room, parlor, innermost or inward part within. So what's within inside that house, what's within inside that house is going to be those precious and pleasant riches, which ultimately go back to the scriptures. All right, the fear of the Lord. All right, knowledge, understanding. All right, discernment. All right, all of those are going to be inside those rooms that essentially make the house to appreciate over time.
Mm-hmm.
Could we get actually let me get this, and we'll get that.
Gone.
This is Second Ezra chapter 14 and verse 13. Finishing out, it says, now therefore set thine house in order, all right, through the wisdom, through the fear, through the knowledge. It says, and reprove thy people, comfort such of them as be in trouble. Isaiah 40 and verse 1 and 2, we got those. Essentially this word acts as a comfort, all right, in these troubling times that we in right now. So it says, and now renounce corruption. All right, let me get another precept. You had something, bro?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 10, and we'll get verse 18. It says, now renounce corruption. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 18. It says, by much slothfulness the building decayeth, and through the idleness of hands the house droppeth through. So we have it's an active process. As the apostles and elders and elder brothers go into. All right, we got to continually stay moving. We got to stay active. And when you go into the scriptures, how an actual house would stay afloat is it wouldn't go into all right, well, you replace the whole thing at one time. It's an active process. All right, well, this wall is messing up. All right, well, it needs to be replaced right now. All right, well, the carpet is messed up. All right, so replace the carpet right now. So it's an active process. The Lord said, occupy until I come. That's a part of the home improvement, staying on top of the things that have to be done.
May I get something for you real quick?
Yeah, you got it.
Because like you mentioned, it's an active process. You got to constantly be replacing things. If you want your house to maintain its value, in the market, you're gonna have to constantly be updating things because things decay over time. You have
Mm-hmm.
mold on the walls. You have things starting to decay, and especially with mold, you got to cut that out. And replace it. You can't just paint over it. You see. But I got this for you. This is Matthew 23 and verse 25. This is going into what Yahushua told the Pharisees. But it says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within you are full of extortion and excess. It says, thou blind Pharisee, clean first that which is within the cup and platter, and the outside of them may be clean also. So pretty much what it's saying here is you got to clean the whole thing. You got to start from the root of the problem, and that's where it starts, the inward man, right? Cleaning out that inward man. And then, you start to build, and that's where that value, starts to appreciate over time, because you're not just painting over it, just like we mentioned the mold on the wall, you're not just painting over it. You're actually removing that out of the way, so that way that rot, that decay won't spread throughout the rest of the house, right?
Mm-hmm.
But continuing on, verse 27, it says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead man's bones and of all uncleanliness. You see, so that's pretty much the point, right? Is you gotta start with the inside, right? The inward man, right? You gotta start with, like when you're building a house, you gotta start with the foundation. If the foundation is off, the whole thing is gonna be off. So you gotta start building up building a good foundation, and from there the rest of the building gets built up, and build it with right materials, not things that's decaying, or you trying to go cheap, you trying to skimp out on some money, and you use materials that's not not going to last or endure over time. Well, the value of the house is not going to appreciate. Eventually that you over here skimping and trying to do things quick. The appreciation might seem good. It might look good from the outside, but once you really start looking in deeper, then you start noticing the flaws of it, and then the appreciation starts to go down, right? And how much more when we're serving the Lord and we're serving Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shai, the Most High sees everything, so everything has to appreciate according to what the Most High standard is. You got it, bro.
Con, I got a quick word. Could you get Psalms 119 and 9? But I got this word right here. It's the word for son. All right, and it says bond. And it says definition. It says the tent was constructed of woven goat hair. Over time, the sun bleaches and weakens the goat hair, necessitating their continual replacement. It says each year, the woman make a new panel approximately 3 feet wide and the length of the tent. It says the old panel is removed, being recycled into a wall or floor, and the new strip is added to the tent. It says since the tent is only replaced one small piece at a time, the tent essentially lasts forever. So it can't be to where as we mentioned, you decide to work on the house at this specific time. All right, it has to be a continual process so that ultimately it can last. All right. So it says the pictograph ba or bayat is a picture of the tent, which bayat goes into a house and then also a tent. It says the na or the seed. It says the nan is a picture of a sprouting seed and represents continuity as the seed continues the next generation. It says the combined meaning of the house, the combined meaning of these letters mean the continuing of the house, so that because the son ultimately continues the house, and the son ultimately continues the father's business. All right, and the Lord Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai is about home improvement. So could we get Psalms chapter 119 and 9?
God, this is Psalms 119 and verse 9. It says, wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his way? By taking heed thereto according to thy word.
Right. And that in the subtitle for that one in the scripture says Beth, but in Hebrew Bahalashwan Quadash it would be Bayat, all right, which means a house. All right, and the house is representative of a house, a tent. It has a wide use of application, but it's likened unto our spirit. So it says, wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his way? All right, by taking heed thereto according to thy word. So ultimately how a house can appreciate, how we can our spirits can appreciate to the Lord, to be something of value. All right, well, we got to cleanse ourselves. All right, how we cleanse ourselves as we, you got, bro, in that Matthew. It can't be to where you like, all right, like how Esau do. He like, fuck it. All right, I'm gonna throw some paint on his mold. All right, I'm gonna paint the whole house. It's gonna be a new house. All right, it has to be on the inside, because the inside, that's going to ultimately wear off onto the outside. The outward man gonna look how the inward man look.
Right.
So from
Essentially, that the rest of that mold will eventually show forth. You know what I'm
Mhm.
saying? Even though you paint over it, it's still going to continue spreading. It's not going to stop it from spreading, right?
Mhm.
So by the time whenever the people come in and try to sand down that paint to see how the damage is, they're going to see the whole wall infected. What once was a little corner of the wall, now it's the whole wall, right? And now you got to rebuild the whole building. And instead of just cutting out that little piece that was, saying that had the mold on it, now you got to take down the whole building.
Right. Could you grab Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 4? I'm gonna get this. This is a Bonsarat, chapter 1 and verse 14. And it says verse 13. All right, because again, we're going into those different rooms. All right, the things that are ultimately going to allow for our spirits, for our house to ultimately appreciate over time, to be an asset versus a liability. Verse 13, a Bonsarat 1 and 13. Whoso feareth the Lord, it shall go well with him at the last, and he shall find favor in the day of his death. To fear the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and it was created with the faithful in the womb. All right, it says to fear the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It ultimately will be wise to fear the Lord, because it's going to keep us out of harm's way. It's going to keep us from, being judged. All right. It says she had built. It says she had built an everlasting foundation with men. Going into how you brought out, that foundation got to be good, because if the foundation is faulty, well, the whole house is going to fall. And being that, we're ultimately going back to Psalms 119 and 9 says, wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his way by taking heed thereto according to thy word. So ultimately by having faith in the Lord Yahweh Shai, all right, and keeping the Lord Yahweh Shai as our ultimate foundation, all right, ultimately, we'll be able to continue. All right. Verse 15, it says, she hath built an everlasting foundation with men. All right, that's that the foundation being the Lord Yahweh Shai. It says, and she shall continue with their seed. To fear the Lord is the fullness of wisdom, and filleth men with her fruits. All right, read it again. To fear the Lord is the fullness of wisdom. So in totality, the fear of the Lord is ultimately says to fear the Lord is the fullness of wisdom. All right, so in totality, wisdom is the fear of the Lord. Doing what the Lord says to do and not doing the things that he told us not to do. All right, that ultimately is wise. That will make one wise. All right,
Hmm.
versus on the contrary, Esau Edom say, well, if you get a degree, if you read this amount of books, if you do this, you do that, you take this test, you'll be a wise person. Your IQ, intelligence, quotient or whatever they call it. The IQ thing. If it's high, that means that you're wise. No, the fear of the Lord makes you wise.
Hmm.
So it says to fear the Lord is the fullness of wisdom, and filleth men with her fruits. All right, and going back into the fruits represent the works. So if one is filled with wisdom, the works, what that man produces is ultimately going to be righteous, fruits, righteous productions, being productive in the spirit. So it says she filleth all their house with things desirable, and the garners with her increase. All right. So going back to Proverbs 24 and it was, let me see, Proverbs 24 and verse. This is Proverbs 24 and verse 3, verse 4. And by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Now reading back Bonsarat 1 and verse, we at verse 17. It says, she filleth all their house with things desirable. All right, those things desirable, as we mentioned before, all right, the knowledge of the scriptures, faith, fear, wisdom. All of those represent those houses. Not the houses, all of those represent the rooms that's going to be a part of that inward man, you know?
Hmm.
Yeah, you get that.
Deuteronomy 4 and verse 4. But ye that did cleave unto the Lord your power are alive, every one of you this day.
Yep. And that word for cleave, it says dabak, and it says clinging, adhering to, joining. It says adhering, so adhering unto what the Lord has told us to do. Though it says, but ye that did cleave unto the Lord, your power are alive, every one of you this day. All right, because that goes into the fear of the Lord. All right, because it said the fullness of wisdom pretty much went into the fear of the Lord. So that's ultimately how we show that we are adhering to, we're clinging unto the Lord by abiding by the house rules.
Mhm. That's part of Deuteronomy what is it, 28 verses 15 on down. Oh, is it, yeah, 28 verses 15 on down, right? You know, if we were to transgress against these laws, you know, we will understand that these curses will fall upon us. You know, and that's the fear of the Lord. Knowing and understanding that the Most High is a man of His word. That you know that if we do go off, that you know He's gonna punish us, man. But if we maintain and keep the law, statutes, and commandments, and do what the Most High demands of us, that He's going to reward us, right? But like you said, that all goes back to the fear of the Lord. You know, if you don't have the fear of the Lord, you know, you're going to do whatever. You know, you pretty much are going to be willful. You're going to do whatever you know your eyes desire, your flesh desires, and ultimately, you know, it's going to bring upon you nothing but evil. You know, it might seem good at first, but down the line, you know, you're going to start receiving or start facing the repercussions of your actions, right? Same thing as like we mentioned of a house, right? If you don't clean the walls, if you don't clean this, if you don't clean that, or fix this or fix that, eventually you're going to be living in a damn a rundown house, right? And then whenever you try to sell the house, you ain't going to get shit for the house.
Right.
But continuing on, Deuteronomy 4 and verse 5. Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, every one of the Lord, Salakia, even as the Lord my power commanded me, that ye should do so in the land, whether ye go to possess it.
Mm-hmm.
Verse 6. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this nation is a great, is a wise, Salakia, this great nation is a wise and understanding people.
Right. So it says, keep therefore and do them. You know, so to keep. All right. That word in Hebrew is shamar. You know, to keep, to guard. All right. To ultimately, because going into that same word, you know, to keep and guard, because it's ultimately our life right there. That's what's ultimately keeping us alive, by observing. That word also goes into to observe. You know, because you have to, you know, watch. All right. What do I have to, you know, fix in my house? What room needs to be fixed? You know, because that also goes into the fear of the Lord. It says, keep therefore and do them. Do is a present word. It's active. You know that means to, you know, to continually do it. All right, because it's not a stopping process. Ecclesiastes 12 and 13 says that, you know, ultimately we was made to fear the Lord. You know, but it says keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. You know, so that goes back to the point that I have brought up in the spirit. Ultimately, you know, Esau's system, he'll say, well, you got to take a IQ test. Well, right here it says that surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. So that's the true IQ test right there. You know, that ultimately shows if someone is wise, if they're fearing the Lord, you know.
I was thinking of that quote by I can't remember his name. I think it was Teddy Roosevelt. How he said that, you know, a thorough understanding of the Bible, you know, is greater than the college degree.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Just showing you how even in this world, your leaders, even they understand that, you know, understanding the Bible, you know, gives you actually more understanding as far as the world and how to operate in the world, and really true wisdom, you know, true common sense than, you know, these colleges today. You know, you made the point of, you know, how you know, in college, or at least in the world, they tell you that you go to college, you know, you get this degree, that degree, you know, you'll be deemed wise in this world, but that's not the case. You know, really, you know, whenever brothers that came into this truth, you know, we surpass, you know, the knowledge of this world, you know, just by having a, you know, a thorough understanding of prophecy of the scriptures, you know, different breakdowns, and even the wisdom that's contained in them. You know, we apply them in real time, and you know, we see a good result out of it. You know, whenever we were once in the world, you know, we will fail and constantly fall into little pit what do you call them, pitfalls
Mm-hmm.
that Esau has laid out. And you know, Jake will be through and don't know how to get out of it. You know, and Esau will give you a so-called throw you in a path to escape, but eventually it just leads you down a deeper hole. But with this truth, you know, we're able to actually have that ladder to get out of those pitfalls and actually operate and see the pitfalls as we navigate.
Right, because scripture go into say, let me get it real fast. This is Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 18, and it says, but the path of the just is as the shining light that shineth more and more until the perfect day. And that's because being that, brothers is ultimately exemplifying the fear of the Lord. The Lord is ultimately growing our vision. So we can see more. That IQ is shooting up. Going into that home improvement.
Uh-huh.
Could you get Matthew 7 and verse 24 to verse 27? I'm gonna get this real fast. This is Psalms chapter 1 and verse 1. In the subtitle, it says the righteous and the wicked contrasted. So it says, blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. All right, reading it again. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. And scriptures tell us to keep our conversation, our conduct, how we walk, blameless. All right. We're traveling, we're being active. We're those houses that are being active. All right. It says, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. And notice how the latter part of that verse goes into standing and sitting. All right. Both of those are something that's being idle, being still. All right. Those in the world, they're still their idle. All right. In whatever facet of life that Esau has given unto them. All right. And that's ultimately why they aren't able to grow. They're not ultimately able to improve. They're stagnant. Verse 2, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doeth he meditate day and night, because that's the rule book. All right. And we ultimately delight in the law of the Lord, because we're focused on, bettering ourselves, going to glory.
Right.
Verse 3, it says, and he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. All right. In which it says he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water. All right. So a tree planted by the rivers of water is ultimately showing forth of life and abundance. All right. Because a tree that's by water, is connected to the source. All right. And the Lord Yahweh Shai is our source. Let me get another one real fast because that's twofold. This is John chapter 7 and verse 38. All right. And it says, he that believeth on me, as the scripture hath said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. And those is ultimately believing on the Lord Yahweh Shai are going to have the mindset of home improvement, but then also bringing out the scriptures. Because as we got in second Esdras chapter 14, it said, set thine house in order and reprove thy people. Comfort such as our. I'm gonna get it real fast. Second Esdras chapter 14 and verse 13. It says, now therefore set thine house in order and reprove thy people, comfort such of them as be in trouble. All right, by bringing out these scriptures, and believing in the Lord Yahweh Shai, we ultimately can, bring out the scriptures and comfort the rest of the elect,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it says, reading it again, John 7 and 38, he that believeth on me, as the scripture hath said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water, because this word is ultimately going to flow out of us,
Right. A living conduit.
Mm-hmm.
Just like when you see, a river, a river that's stagnant, it's death all around it. It stinks. It produces this nasty smell. A bunch of bugs and shit just, swarming around, and really no life. It really can exist around it besides these nasty creatures like toads and frogs and all these, nasty things. But when you see a actual, a flowing river, you will see trees, growing on the sides of the river. You'll see greenery, and even the air that you breathe will be fresh, you know. But something that's stagnant, it just won't produce life, right? So that's why whenever the scriptures talk about how out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water, it's pretty much letting you know that somebody who is operating in the true spirit will be constantly flowing, constantly um, producing, constantly moving. You ain't gonna be staying in one spot, just fixated on one thing. You're gonna be constantly, like you mentioned, going glory from glory, right? Want me to read Matthew 7? I think the brother got kicked out. Let me read this. Let me read Matthew 7. Wait for him to come back in. This is Matthew 7 and verse 24. It says, therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man, which built his house upon a rock. Right. And that's essentially, what the elect are doing. Right. Hey, Shalom, bro.
Shalom, shalom.
Khan. So I'm gonna read this back. I was reading Matthew 7.
Okay.
Matthew 7:24. It says, Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock.
All right, in the subtitle in the blue letter, it says the two foundations. All right, notice how in each of the scriptures, or a few of the scriptures that we got, it says to do, to actively be doing it. So it says, therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man, because the sayings are ultimately the things that's going to be in the inward man, in the inner parts, in those rooms. The knowledge, the wisdom, the fear, all right, the faith, the stability that comes with the scriptures. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So it says, therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock, because we're talking about those houses. All right. So which houses is ultimately going to be the ones that are stand the test of time and the different adversities, the ones that ultimately build their house upon the rock. All right, the Lord Yahweh Shai, the true foundation.
Mm-hmm. Verse 25, it says, And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock.
Right. So it says, the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. On something that was sturdy, something that was stable. So in construction terms, they would actually call the rains or the floods, the winds. They'll call those environmental loads. Things that ultimately is going to bear down on a house. All right, and a true house ultimately is going to be able to withstand those things. You see, but we're going into two different types of houses right now. We're going into a good house, and we're going into a bad house. All right, that good house, all right, the one that is ultimately rooted in the Lord, Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, all right, is going to withstand that pressure, the adversity that's coming upon the planet Earth. All right, I'm gonna read it again. Verse 25 says, "And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock." All right, the different things that the Lord, the judgments is coming upon the planet Earth. The elect man is ultimately going to be present as these things are taking place. All right, but the elect ultimately is going to be able to withstand, all right, those structural and environmental loads. All right, being the judgments that the Lord is ultimately sending.
Mhm. That's ultimately because, like you mentioned, they built their house on that rock. If they would have built that house anywhere else, it would fail. It would fall, right? As a matter of fact, I think it's going to go into it, so I don't want to jump the gun. I'm going to continue reading. Verse 26, it says, And everyone that heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them not shall be likened unto a foolish man which built his house upon the sand.
It says, "And everyone that heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them not shall be likened unto a foolish man which built his house upon the sand." All right, those are the ones that ultimately were slothful. All right, as we got in Ecclesiastes 10 and 18, through much slothfulness and idleness, roughly paraphrasing, the house decayeth. It's going to fall through. It's not going to be something that's going to actually stand. All right, those represent 2/3. Those that essentially made the ways of Esau, Edom, their defense. All right, their stability. All right, the ones that ultimately entrusted in things are opposite of the scriptures.
That's right. That's right. It says, verse 27, And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it.
It says, "And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it." So 2/3. All right, again, those that ultimately confided in the ways of this world. All right, whether it be so-called Christianity, Islam, so on and so forth. All right, those are going to be the ones that are they're going to be destroyed. Because the Lord is focused on the inward man. All right, not what's on the outside, not things that ultimately look good. You know.
Mhm. That's the reason why in the scripture it talks about, they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, because they relied upon the princes of this world. They relied upon their leaders, their their politicians, right? Their policies, their laws, right? To essentially save them. But as we're seeing right now, America being in the state that it is, we're seeing that all this is about to collapse. America is just a house of cards. All it takes is one stiff blow, and it's going to go down. This is the house built upon that sand, because it's not built upon that rock, which is Yahweh Shah. But those of us that's departing from this place, as the scripture says, they shall no longer lean upon them who smote them. meaning we're no longer trusting in this system. We're no longer trusting on Esau, Edom, right? We're no longer trusting on the ways of this world to deliver us, right? We're trusting on the Lord, right? And we're being, faithful, uh, that the Lord's word is going to come in and redeem us in the time that is appropriate for him, right? Because even though we might want to get out of here, as soon as possible, brothers, hey, we want out of here, man. We see the hell going on. We're tired of this shit, but still, that's a patience that is required of us to be able to endure all these tempests. As we mentioned, the rains and the floods, right? Which is just a similitude of all the hell that's about to be brought forth in the tests, right? Well, we got to be able to endure that because that's the reason why we're building this house. We're fortifying ourselves to be able to withstand these evil days. You see, but again, we understand that protection is coming, and that protection is there for those of us that are seeking after it, and that comes by us being diligent in this thing, continuing to work, continuing to build up ourselves in the spirit, to endure in these days. But what you got it, bro?
Con. That's pretty much all I had. If you ain't had nothing.
That was pretty much it too.
Con. Well, I don't want to Tazaza about Naya Apollos. What was a beautiful edification through the spirit. Well, I don't want to Tazah. Atam Yashka Awam Tawa. Lord's will, you all have a good day. Well, we can go ahead and close it up by saying, Call Halayim La. Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham Rachak, Wadashwa, double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone that taught us this truth and rule well. And much respect to you, bros, out there pushing this truth with all righteousness and sincerity. Shalom, shalom.
Shalom.